This is the third lecture in my series exploring the life and works of Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, the man many people believe wrote under the name William Shakespeare, through the women who knew him best. Because if you want to understand a man, ask the women in his life. There's plenty of historical evidence that Oxford loved women, but loving women is not the same as listening to them. And it took him time and hard lessons to learn to respect their agency. Those lessons began with his sister, Vere Bertie. If you're curious about the other women in the series, Oxford's wives, Anne Cecil and Elizabeth Trentham, you can find those lectures on YouTube under their names or on my website, dorotheadickerman.com. Together, they offer fresh insights into Oxford, the works attributed to Shakespeare, and the world of Elizabethan history. 100 years ago, in a room of one's own, Virginia Woolf imagined Shakespeare's sister, not Will of Stratford's real sister, Joan, but a fictional Judith, a silenced genius meant to embody women writers' struggle against the patriarchy. Woolf never questioned whether the name William Shakespeare might also have been a fiction. Oxford, however, had two sisters, Mary and a half-sister, Katherine. Shortly after their father's death, Katherine sued to have Oxford and Mary declared illegitimate to claim the Oxford earldom for her son, a spiteful move that might have provoked him to write The Loss of My Good Name. But what of Mary? Aside from jokes that her quick tongue inspired Katherina in the Taming of the Shrew, Mary is largely absent from Oxford's narrative. Reducing Mary to a shrew, albeit a tamed one, elicits chuckles at her expense. But Mary wasn't just Oxford's sister. She was his lifelong friend and ally, his mirror, his conscience, at times his adversary, and she profoundly changed his perception of women. Mary Vere is the overlooked Shakespearean heroine. She deserves our close attention. Not only was she the model for several Shakespearean heroines, one of the greatest wartime speeches ever written was written about her. Unlike the silent, submissive ideals of Elizabethan womanhood, Shakespeare's heroines are intelligent, flawed, funny, wronged, and capable, not Woolf's victims, but victors. This talk argues first that Oxford's perception of women evolved significantly over time, largely because of Mary, who outmaneuvered just about everyone, including her brilliant brother. And second, that Shakespeare's plays reflect not only Oxford's private life, but Mary's. So, if you love Shakespearean heroines, thank Mary Vere. I want to thank and recommend Margot Anderson's research on Mary in Shakespeare by Another Name, and Catherine Children's bringing Mary's portrait to life. I'll briefly touch on their work, then dive deeper using period letters, legal documents, my travels on Oxford's trail in England, Italy, and the Netherlands, biographies, histories, and of course, Shakespeare's plays. In addition to Taming of the Shrew, we'll find Mary Vere's influence in Cymbeline, Twelfth Night, The Winter's Tale, Hamlet, Henry IV, Part 1, and Othello, before returning to Taming to examine Katherina's enigmatic closing speech. Though I don't have time to read all the slides, they echo Mary's life so closely that I hope to convince you that Shakespeare knew her personally and profoundly well. Mary was born to John de Vere, 16th Earl of Oxford, and his Countess Marjorie Golding Vere, a couple of years after her brother. They were children when their father died suddenly in August 1562, just days after executing a new will and arranging Oxford's future marriage to a sister of the Earl of Huntingdon. In Tudor England, a nobleman's death was equivalent to a shipwreck for his widow and minor children. John's lands, income, Edward, and Mary became the crown's property. Widows were deemed unfit to manage or protect them. Witnessing his family's physical and financial splintering as a child likely inspired Oxford as an adult to create his groundbreaking estate plan described in my Elizabeth Trentham lecture. But in 1562, the destruction was just beginning. Shortly after John's death, Marjorie married Charles Tyrrell, Hedingham Castle's bailiff. Why is unclear. Most widowed countesses remarried other noblemen. While distantly related to the de Veres, Tyrrell was not noble. Oxford's godfather, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, gained complete control of the de Vere lands until Oxford came of age. Perhaps someone pressured Marjorie, and hastily marrying her late husband's bailiff, allowed her to remain at Hedingham Castle, albeit in humbler quarters, to protect her children. A month later, she and Mary were separated from 12-year-old Oxford, who traveled to London to live with William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, and his wife Mildred as a royal ward. Securing funds to purchase Mary's wardship may also explain Marjorie's hasty matrimony. In early December 1568, Marjorie died, leaving Mary at about 15 and Oxford at 18 fully orphaned. Oxford, still under Cecil's guardianship, was at Gray's Inn when his mother died. But if Mary had remained with their mother, where did Mary go? Mildred Cook Cecil and her sister Elizabeth Cook Hoby were two of Sir Anthony Cook's 5 famously learned daughters. In a 1597 letter defending Mary against slander, Elizabeth defiantly called her "my daughter." Given Elizabeth's fierce loyalty and maternal language, the Cecil's guardianship of Oxford, and the Cook sisters' intermediary roles in wardship negotiations, Burleigh likely placed Mary in Elizabeth's household after Marjorie's death until Oxford could support her. Elizabeth had followed her ambassador husband to France with small children and returned widowed to England to deliver Thomas Posthumous Hoby. In Elizabeth's care, Mary would have received a rigorous education, regular visits to Cecil House, and the companionship of 2 foster brothers, Edward and Posthumous Hoby, and 2 foster sisters, who died the same year Oxford reluctantly wed Anne, who is Elizabeth's niece. After a second husband's early death thwarted her ambition to be Countess of Bedford, Elizabeth simply claimed the title, asking no one's permission, and later used it battling Oxford over the Blackfriars Theatre. Both Elizabeth and Mary followed their husbands abroad at great personal risk, spoke their sharp minds, defied social conventions, successfully stood up to Oxford. Elizabeth's elder son, Edward, named his only child Peregrine, like Mary's husband, just as Shakespeare named Cymbeline's fictional hero Posthumus, like Elizabeth's younger son. Coincidence? Maybe, but keep it in mind. 1574 spun the Vere siblings in unexpected directions. In January, court gossip reached the Earl of Rutland from Eleanor Bridges, a maid of honor, that the Queen had struck Mary Shelton, a gentlewoman of the Privy Chamber, and used evil words about her wish to marry John Scudamore, a Catholic. Bridges' letter also records that Mary had been sworn one of the Privy Chamber, a position she would hold until the Queen's death. The letter's date varies across transcriptions. One says 1574, another 1576 ? But January 1574 is almost certainly correct because by that summer, the Queen had approved Mary Shelton's marrying Scudamore and given her wedding clothes. To be sworn in as a lady of the Privy Chamber, young, unmarried, without having been a maid of honor or close royal relation, was an honor. Ladies of the Privy Chamber assisted the Queen dressing and with her intimate personal care, provided companionship, and exercised what Warren Skidmore calls considerable influence on wardships, pensions, lands, and military, university, and ecclesiastical preferments. In 1574, while rumors about Oxford's involvement with the Queen swirled, Mary's sworn secrecy would be convenient, both for her brother's clandestine visits and if the Queen were pregnant. Oxford fled England without permission that July, yet by August he was welcomed back to court without a single smack or evil word. That autumn, the drama intensified. Leicester's rape of Anne Cecil upended Oxford's life. At the same time, Charles, Earl of Lennox, and Elizabeth Cavendish suddenly married, just 3 days after meeting each other. Even more shocking, the bride was supposed to be marrying Peregrine Bertie, son of the formidable Catherine Willoughby Brandon Bertie, Duchess of Suffolk, noted for her quick wit, sharp tongue, and excellent education. The problem? Peregrine had made it widely known he didn't like Elizabeth Cavendish. The Duchess's mother and Peregrine's grandmother, Maria de Salinas, had come from Spain with Catherine of Aragon. Though half Spanish by blood, like the Cecils and the Cooks, the Duchess was a stalwart Protestant reformist. She named her spaniel after Catholic Bishop Gardiner so she could command it, "Heel, Gardiner, heel." At 14, she became 49-year-old Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk's fourth wife. His third had been Henry VIII's sister. When he died, the young Duchess married her choice, her master of the horse and gentleman usher, Richard Bertie, the son of a stonemason. She also asked no one's permission. In December, preparing to travel as the Queen's representative to France and Venice, Oxford named Mary as his sole heir in his will, despite his wife Anne's first pregnancy in 3 years. He also obtained from Sir Thomas Smith the first of at least the 2 abortifacients and desperately wanted, indicating they both knew the child wasn't his. While Oxford was abroad for over a year, and the issue of Anne's bastard boiled in letters between him and Burleigh, Mary served as a lady of the Privy Chamber and endured insipid verses from flatterers. Meanwhile, 20-year-old Peregrine Bertie made himself better known at court, and not in the usual way. He called courtiers reptilia and said he was about as comfortable among them as a lion on a feather bed. Guess which man Mary preferred, and had for some time. Peregrine had been educated at Cecil House under Burleigh during Oxford's wardship there. Oxford, Mary, Peregrine, and Anne Cecil had all known each other from their teens. In early 1577, more news reached Rutland. Mary was betrothed. By law, Oxford had the right to place his sister in a marriage advantageous to himself and their family. Yet the match he chose seems baffling. Gerald Fitzgerald, Lord Garrett, namesake and heir of the 11th Earl of Kildare and his wife Mabel Brown. Garrett's father, the so-called Wizard Earl, was known for alchemy and for converting himself to Protestantism. Still, his patchy record for treason landed him under house arrest in London until his death. The earldom was obscure. Mary would have had to move to Ireland. As holder of the second oldest English earldom and Lord High Chamberlain of England, surely Oxford could have found more strategic matches. With no brothers, why squander this opportunity to bring a powerful brother-in-law into the family as an ally? Why on earth choose Garrett? Here's one explanation. Anthony Browne, Lord Montague, had 2 sisters, Mabel and Mary. Mabel had married Kildare, therefore their son, Lord Garrett, was first cousin to Anthony Browne's daughter, Mary Brown Risley, Countess of Southampton. If Oxford had fathered a son with the Queen, and Burleigh had discreetly placed the infant with the Southamptons, then Oxford's marrying his sister to Garrett would give Oxford access through her to his son. Charlotte Stopes, in her Life of Henry, 3rd Earl of Southampton, observed that while official records list Henry, called Harry, as the Southamptons' only son, quote, "It has always been said he was the second son, but there is no authority," end quote, indicating that an older son vanished from history. Of course, the authority for Harry's official records is untrustworthy because it was Burleigh, jotting notes 16 years after Harry's undocumented birth. Harry had neither baptismal records nor documented godparents. The Countess's husband, the 2nd Earl of Southampton, was a Catholic activist, arrested and imprisoned multiple times for treason, but always released. Did he and Burleigh strike a bargain? Freedom in exchange for raising Harry in place of a dead heir? But I hear you. Assuming Harry was Oxford's son by the Queen, how could Burleigh possibly have placed him with the Southamptons sufficiently discreetly and kept it quiet? Easily done. Anthony Browne's other sister, Mary, had married Lord John Grey. Their daughter, Frances Grey, was also the Countess of Southampton's first cousin and was married to Mildred Cooke, Cecil's brother, William Cooke. Therefore, through close family members, the Cecils could have sequestered Harry with the Southamptons with only 6 people knowing: the Cecils, the Cookes, and the Southamptons. Marrying Mary to Garrett would also make Mary the Countess's first cousin. So let's revisit the passage from Cymbeline and eavesdrop on Oxford and Mary arguing about her rejecting his choice of a husband for her. The text reveals how Shakespeare worked. He merely reproduced Oxford and Mary's private conversation, substituting a father-daughter relationship for a brother-sister relationship. Oxford says that Mary might have had access to Queen Elizabeth's sole son if she'd married Garrett. Mary retorts that Peregrine's an eagle, peregrine falcons being royal prince's birds. He's no scavenging puttock like Garrett, who historically amounted to exactly nothing. Peregrine's poor and base, Oxford throws out. He's ruining Oxford's chance for the throne. Mary says she doesn't care and blames Oxford because she and Peregrine grew up as playfellows at Cecil House. Mary and Peregrine had had a thing for each other for a very long time. In 1577, Oxford may have been willing to sacrifice Mary's happiness for Harry. Oxford controlled Mary's marriage, but not his own. He couldn't divorce Anne because Burleigh was muddying the waters publicly and with the Queen. But if Oxford secured access to Harry through Mary, then he could divorce Anne and try to persuade the Queen to marry him and legitimize their son, who under this scenario would be the next King of England. To Oxford, still young and seeking leverage for family stability, a marriageable sister was a pawn in a very high-stakes game. When Mary refused, she forced him to look in the mirror. We know how Mary escaped her betrothal to witless Garrett and married poor but worthy Peregrine from a stunning series of 3 1577 letters Peregrine Bertie, Duchess of Suffolk, wrote to Burleigh. Her first hinted that because Peregrine was a little wild, Burleigh might send him from court while all was still well. But by July, her second letter described a very different array on the betrothal battlefield. My wise son has gone very far with Lady Mary de Vere. I fear too far to turn. Since they hadn't been married by December, it appears that the lion had already shared the feather bed. I had rather he had matched in any other place, and I told her the causes. Her friends make small account of me. Her brother did what in him lay to deface my husband and son. Peregrine has taken Mary's honor. What do you expect her brother to do? Besides, our religions agree not. Despite the Cook sisters, Mary wasn't Calvinist. And I cannot tell what more. If she should prove like her brother, if an empire follows her, I should be sorry to match so. She said she couldn't rule her brother's tongue, nor help the rest of his faults. But for herself, she trusted I should have no cause to mislike her. And seeing it was so far forth between my son and her, she deserved my goodwill and asked no more. Mary had volleyed back. I'm not my brother, nor his keeper, and your son and I have already slept together. That's a seemly thing, quoth I, for you to live on. For I fear that Master Bertie will so much mislike of these dealings, he will give little more than his goodwill, if he give that. Attack number 1. Besides, if her majesty shall mislike of it, sure we turn him to the wide world. Attack number 2. She told me how Lord Sussex and Master Hatton had promised to speak for her to the Queen, and that I would require you to do the like. Like any good general, Mary anticipated attacks 1 and 2, and recruited powerful allies before tackling the Duchess. I told her her brother used you and your daughter so evil that I could not require you to deal in it. That is true, although Anne's bastard had caused Oxford deep dishonor and Burleigh had forced Anne on him. Well, if I would write, she knew you would do it for my sake. Mary had also anticipated attack number 3. brilliant political maneuvering. And since there was no undoing it, she trusted I could, for my son's sake, help now. Mary presented the Duchess with the fait accompli. Mary was no longer a virgin, and Peregrine was responsible. Meanwhile, Peregrine had been locked up by his parents, with no access to ink and paper. Or so they thought. Compare his response to Mary's letter about her showdown with his mother to Posthumus's letter to Imogen. But did Peregrine really expect Oxford not to be furious when he'd slept with Oxford's sister and ruined his plans? By November, Rutland received news that Mary's wedding was deferred until after Christmas because neither the Queen nor Oxford had wholly assented thereto. The Duchess's December letter to Burleigh revealed that the battlefield alliances had shifted again. It described a scene from Oxford's and Mary's lives that appears in The Winter's Tale. Only Will of Stratford didn't invent it. Oxford's clever sister did, working her new alliance with her future mother-in-law to capture Burleigh's consent and, through Burleigh, the Queen's, thereby isolating her brother. Burleigh desperately needed Oxford to take back Anne and agree to raise Anne's child Bess. For 2 years, Oxford had refused, confirming Anne's infidelity, deepening the Cecils' humiliation, and setting Leicester and Oxford on a collision course that could only end badly. But Mary had a plan to solve everyone's problems, and here is how it unfolded. She set up Peregrine's sister Susan and Harry Cook to casually mention to the Duchess that they thought Oxford would very gladly see Bess, but not through Harry's cook's wife and not at Cecil House because it would look like a Cecil set-up. The Duchess explained it to Burleigh. Because it was but a young man's words, I took no great hold of it. But the idea was planted. A few days later, the Duchess visited Mary. Mary asked what the Duchess would say if her brother would take his wife again. Truly, quoth the Duchess, nothing could comfort me more, for now I wish to your brother as much goodwill as to my own son. Indeed, Mary replied, he would very fain see the child, but is loath to send for her, thereby repeating the idea she had already had Harry and Susan plant. Enchanted, and swearing Mary to secrecy, the Duchess described her idea to invite Mary and Oxford to her house and then bring out Bess and see how nature will work in him to like it and tell him it's his own. In The Winter's Tale, the formidable Paulina brings the infant Perdita to Leontes, hoping he'll accept the child as his own. It seems the Duchess actually brought little Bess to Oxford, but the historical genius behind this real-life drama was never acknowledged. Setting up Susan Bertie and Harry Cook to drop the idea to the Duchess empowered the Duchess to take all the credit with Burleigh for solving his problem and positioned the Duchess to ask Burleigh to solve Mary's. Tactics worthy of a military general. By the way, how did Will of Stratford access Burleigh's personal correspondence from the Duchess? Like Leontes and Paulina, the Duchess's presenting little Bess did not change Oxford's mind about Anne. However, he forgave Peregrine and surrendered to Mary the right to choose her husband, a theme that drives the action in Cymbeline, A Midsummer Night's Dream, Romeo and Juliet, Merchant of Venice, All's Well, and Othello. Transforming Oxford, trapped in his own miserable marriage, into a champion of marrying for love was a major step in freeing him as a playwright to create the greatest heroines in English literature, using Anne Cecil as the model for Hermione and Lucrece, Elizabeth Trentham for Rosamond and Viola, and Mary for Imogen and Desdemona. The Duchess bestowed Grinsthorpe Castle as a wedding gift, and at her death, the barony of Willoughby de Eresby. Their wedding, at about the turn of the year, has been cited to compare Mary to Katherina and Peregrine to Petruchio. But there is so much more of Mary and Peregrine than just their comedic bantering in Taming of the Shrew, a play that overflows with raging war, military terminology, miserable cold, hunger, mud, lack of appropriate clothing and sleep, but so subtly that you may have overlooked it in sunny, peaceful Padua. those war images tell us we're further north than fruitful Lombardy. Meanwhile, don't miss the de Vere heraldic symbol in that quote, the angry boar. Mary and Peregrine were well matched. Of their 8 children, 5 daughters and 5 sons survived, one named Varus. If Mary did not fit the Tudor role model of a compliant, silent woman, then neither did her foster mother, Elizabeth Hoby, nor her mother-in-law, the Duchess of Sussex. Part Spanish through his mother, Peregrine had been born in Germany during Mary Tudor's reign and his parents' self-imposed wandering exile, hence his name, Peregrine, or Pilgrim. As an adult, he lived up to it. The Queen sent him abroad repeatedly as diplomatic and military commander, which suited his talents and restless energy. In 1582, Peregrine went as special ambassador to Elsinore, Denmark, the very setting for Hamlet, to halt Danish attacks on English shipping and invest Danish King Frederick with the Order of the Garter. He returned in 1585, seeking Danish support for England's Netherlands campaign. In his relation of my Lord Willoughby's embassy into Denmark, Peregrine described hunting and drinking with Frederick at Castle Kronborg, now called Hamlet's Castle, where toasts were, in his words, performed after a whole volley of all the great shot of the castle discharged, a royal feast, and a most artificial and cunning fireworks. The echoes in Hamlet are unmistakable. In 1586, Danish Chancellor Henrik Rammel came to Greenwich with musicians and actors, several trained in an English troupe at the Danish court. When Rammel returned to Elsinore, Wilcamp and Thomas Pope, later Shakespeare's colleagues, went with him, bringing to mind the players Hamlet employs. As Anderson, Hank Whittemore, and others note, among the Danish courtiers Peregrine met at Elsinore were a Rosencrantz and 2 Guildensterns. Shakespeare didn't invent those details. He borrowed them from Mary's husband. This humorous, intimate test of wills between Harry Percy, known as Hotspur, and his wife Kate, Lady Percy, veils their anxiety about his returning to war. He withholds information, claiming she'll let it slip. She teases about breaking his little finger. It's a familiar lover's game, but even his promise to send for her can't hide that they may never meet again. For Shakespeare's Lady Percy, that proves sadly true. But here's the telling detail. The historical Lady Percy was named Elizabeth, not Kate, and that's no mistake by the bard. As in Taming, Bonnie Kate, and sometimes Kate the Cursed, but Kate, the prettiest Kate in all of Christendom, Oxford is teasing Mary, naming her characters in both plays Catherine, like her formidable mother-in-law, and their hated half-sister. Another indication that this loving, aching banter between the Percys was modeled after Mary and her self-described testy and choleric Peregrine when he's leaving for war again. England's improbable victory over the 1588 Spanish Armada often dominates Elizabethan military history narratives. But England was heavily involved in the Netherlands' 80 Years' War, both 20 years before and 60 years thereafter. Holding the Spanish back from occupying the northern Dutch provinces kept them from using the Dutch coast to launch an invasion. Over decades, Oxford himself, his sons, grandson, cousins, and brother-in-law all did military service on Dutch soil to protect England. While Oxford also penned patriotic plays, Peregrine was responsible for Lady Percy's list: men's, munitions, supplies, strategy, and survival in the field for thousands of Englishmen. Both brothers-in-law served brilliantly, but only Peregrine was celebrated, although it cost him and Mary their fortune and much more. Mary's warriors began in 1586, when Peregrine was sent to The Hague and then to govern Bergen-op-Zoom under Leicester's command. By 1587, Leicester was recalled to England and royally chastised for his failures, including a major defeat at Zutphen, where Philip Sidney foolishly removed his leg armor because his men had none and died for it. Peregrine replaced Leicester as supreme commander and general of all English forces in the Netherlands. In the autumn of 1588, Peregrine won an enormous victory over 20,000 Spanish and the Duke of Parma at the siege of Bergen-op-Zoom. By releasing water built up behind dikes, he drowned most of the Spanish troops surrounding the town. He trapped the rest between the town's portcullis and its gates and annihilated them. This utter rout turned the tide of the land war against Spain and made Peregrine very famous in England. Meanwhile, home alone and heavily pregnant, Mary prepared to entertain the Danish ambassador. She named the baby Sophia to honor the Danish queen, but also Catherine, because she knew Peregrine loved it quite well. Another reason Vernon used Oxford to choose the name for Mary's character in Taming and Henry IV. By Peregrine's 1589 return to England, their annual income of £2,200 had been swallowed to keep his men fed, clothed, and armed. They sold timber, liquidated his inheritance from his father, mortgaged lands, and pawned Mary's jewels to cover £4,000 in war debt that they had personally assumed. The Queen offered letters of praise and a pair of gloves. Ballads were sung in the streets in Peregrine's honor, but that's all they received. Their time together at home was brief. Over the summer, civil war broke out in France. The Protestant Henri de Navarre nominally became King of France, but it took years of war and Navarre's conversion to Catholicism to secure the throne. The Queen sent Peregrine with 4,000 men to aid Navarre. Again, crown funds were insufficient, the troops hungry and ill-furnished. Peregrine and Mary personally paid for hose and shoes to stem desertions. Check the quote. Like Henry V, Peregrine captured Harfleur. At the siege of Paris, Navarre gifted him a diamond ring that Peregrine never sold, not even to feed his troops. He gave it to his and Mary's eldest son on his deathbed. Check the quote. Queen Elizabeth's intractable stinginess left Peregrine to beg Burleigh for reimbursement. Burleigh provided nothing to the famous war hero and his wife. Instead, his servants attacked theirs with halberds and billhooks outside their Stamford house, while Mary, pregnant again, barricaded herself inside. It was well known that Burleigh's thugs controlled Stamford. Meanwhile, Peregrine's health began to fail. He took several trips alone to the spa in Luclin, Germany, and became seriously ill in Venice, and only with great difficulty managed to return to England. 1597 marked the saddest chapter of Mary's life. Perhaps from poor health and the accumulated strain of war, Peregrine believed a rumor that she had taken a lover during his long absences. He cast her out. Mary denied it, as did Elizabeth Cook, calling Mary my daughter and vouching for her honor. By now, the three women closest to Oxford, Anne Cecil, Elizabeth Trentham, and Mary Vere, had each shaped his perspective on women. But that hallmark Shakespearean championing of women may not have fully emerged until he watched his sister, wrongly accused of infidelity, and her husband respond stubbornly and even insanely. As Oxford helplessly watched Mary suffer, Shakespeare's characters reached new emotional depths. While Winter's tale's Leontes echoes Oxford himself and Mary's clever ploy to win over the Duchess, Posthumus and Othello have much more in common with Peregrine. Like Peregrine, they are outsiders to the established aristocracy and brilliant generals who win great victories and then fall victim to whispers about their wives' infidelity. And when you know her story, you see Mary in Imogen and Desdemona. Perhaps Cymbeline's happy ending, Posthumus's finally recognizing Imogen's loyalty, was Oxford nudging Peregrine towards reason. Imogen's sharp tongue neatly beheads oafish Cloten's obnoxious advance, yet only Shakespearean interventions of faithful servant and sheer chance keep her from the murder Posthumus orders and lead her to those two long-missing brothers, possibly inspired by Edward and Posthumus Hovey. But Othello exposes Peregrine's dark side and Mary's plight. Othello's murder of Desdemona enacts Oxford's lament for what he witnessed but couldn't prevent, Mary's emotional suffocation by Peregrine. In Desdemona's haunting deathbed green willow song lies a simple pun on Mary's name. Green in French is Vere. Mary's married title was Lady Willoughby. So green, willow, willow, willow identifies Mary Vere, Lady Willoughby. In the first folio's Othello, Willow is spelled O-U-G-H, exactly as in her title. In Othello, Barbary, which is used 3 times, refers to the North African Berbers or Moors who conquered Spain in 711. Like the sword of Spain, alluding to Peregrine's Spanish heritage and his victory at Bergen op Zoom, where he slaughtered thousands of Spanish for England. Parallels between Peregrine and Othello permeate the play. Their foreignness, uprooted pasts, restlessness, blunt, quick manners, military greatness, and personal fragility born of great love. Even Shakespeare's magic couldn't mend Peregrine's troubled mind about Mary. He sought appointment as governor of Berwick-upon-Tweed, a remote garrison on the Scottish border, and died there from a fever in 1601, unreconciled with Mary, though their son, Robert, in a letter, shows that he and Oxford had a very close relationship. Mary lived to see the 1609 publication of the sonnets and the 1623 First Folio. She watched the next generation take up family and political and emotional battles, including opposition to the Spanish match. In a later phase of the 80 Years' War, Henry de Vere, Harry's son James, and Mary's grandson Montague Bertie all volunteered in the Netherlands. She died just before they did, on June 24th, 1624, 20 years to the day after Oxford. Mary and Oxford forged fierce loyalty in their children. Their sons endured wounds and imprisonment defending their female cousins' rights to choose their husbands, a testament to Mary and Oxford's bond. In 1647, Oxford's great-granddaughter, Bridget Ray Sackville, married Mary's grandson, Montague Bertie, Earl of Lindsey, bringing the Oxford earldom and the hereditary office of the Lord Great Chamberlain of England back into the united bloodline of these 2 remarkable siblings. Katherina's closing speech in The Taming of the Shrew, a comedy unpublished until the First Folio, has long baffled audiences. Productions twist it, trim it, reinterpret it. Modern directors try endless gimmicks not to offend. But this extraordinary speech, equal to Portia's on the quality of mercy, is not difficult if you know Taming's historical context and who Katherina is. The prior version, A Taming of a Shrew, didn't contain the speech. The first known public performance was in June 1594, but versions likely entertained audiences at court earlier. Its sudden tonal shift from farce to solemnity and its pervasive military language suggests it was written between 1586 and 89, when Peregrine was general of English ground forces in the Netherlands, and Mary was crossing the Channel to deliver supplies in person to the battlefields. Its rousing message to Elizabethan women falls from the lips of no lesser person than the famous general's wife, the unmistakably well-known Vere Bertie. Picture Clementine Churchill broadcasting these lines on the BBC during the Blitz. In the late 1580s, the English believed a Spanish invasion was imminent. Rumors of Catholic plots to replace the Queen with Mary, Queen of Scots, and Spanish ships off the English coast swept through the streets. The country was at war. Leicester had failed. The Queen refused to see him. Every English hope to hold the northern Dutch provinces rested on Peregrine's shoulders. In the winter of 1586, Mary wrote Peregrine begging him to confirm in his own hand that she was to send 60 suits of armor from their personal arsenal for his troops. Appalled at the wretched conditions, she feared he would die from disease. Once satisfied, she collected the armor, and remember, Philip Sidney died because his troops had none, plus a bed and a tent, as Peregrine requested. John Stubbs, then the Willoughby's secretary, wrote Peregrine that Mary, a noble woman, trussed them up and made them ready, going about it herself. Mary added, "I love you." The next year, she mastered wartime logistics again, packing up what Peregrine requested and delivering it herself, crossing the Channel in bitter January into a war zone, meeting Peregrine at Gertrudenberg in North Brabant. In 1588, she sent him a de Vere family jewel encrusted with 23 diamonds and 2 salts of gold. She hawked their plate, And in January 1589, with more supplies, she again gave up her fashionable court dress and cap and crossed the Channel into a war zone, not to sunny Padua, but to The Hague, enduring miserable, wet, cold travel, mud, poor lodging, and hunger, just like Katherina. That Peregrine wrote, "I found my wife here before I looked for her coming," demonstrates her speed. Under these conditions, her beloved Peregrine at war on foreign soil, commanding thousands of cold, half-starved soldiers with armor in critical supply, how would Mary Vere Bertie rally other English women in a war for national survival? She would lead by example. Let me ask you, how many of you ride horses? If you want to mount and I do this, what am I doing? Thank you. I am placing my hands below your foot to give you a leg up onto your horse. When Katherina, whom Shakespeare's audience knew was Mary, says, "Place your hands below your husband's foot, in token of which duty, if he please, my hand is ready, may it do him ease," she was urging English women, safe and warm at home, to follow her example and make some sacrifices to give their weary warrior husbands in armor a leg up onto the saddle. War echoes throughout Taming, crescendoing with this extraordinary wartime address, rousing English women to support their men at war. Katherina's words are no subjugation, no bow to the patriarchy. They are a very brave woman's rallying cry and a public acknowledgement of Mary's heroism and her crucial role in England's defense. Oxford was immensely proud of his sister. Mary personally delivered to Peregrine anything he asked for from their possessions, which is why Petruchio says of Katherina, "She is my goods, my chattel. She is my house, my household stuff, my field, my barn, my horse, my ox, my ass, my anything. And here she stands. Touch her, whoever dare." And that is how Shakespeare immortalized his most deserving and most overlooked heroine, Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, and Shakespeare's sister, Mary Bertie. Thank you very much.